Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I'm David Cohen. I'm Carla Cohen of Blessed Memory's husband, and we're here to welcome Jonathan Rieder for another appearance at Politics and Prose. Jonathan was here for his wonderful book, The Word of the Lord is Upon Me, the righteous performance of Martin Luther King Jr., which is an absolutely rich book on the influence of language and rhetoric and the ideas that influenced Dr. King. I'm a long admirer of yours, Jonathan. I started with your book on Canarsie, Italians and Jews Against Liberalism in Canarsie. And as a young boy, I would go to Canarsie to visit relatives, and I'm sure I wasn't part of the Italian part. But we're here really to celebrate the publication of the Gospel of Freedom. And this is the 50th anniversary, and I'm sure Jonathan will tell us about the significance of 1963 in Birmingham. It's the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and when I read you, as I have, I keep thinking of Gary Wills and his use of history and language also to talk about the influence of how the Gettysburg Address, which just didn't come from writing on the back of an envelope. There was a lot more to it than that. So we're here to deal with anniversaries. This is part of Politics and Prose. Books are important, but it's also a literary and cultural center. And next week, for example, there will be a panel discussion at 11 o'clock on Sunday on the influence of civil rights in Washington, D.C. and its connection to the national movement. And there will be writers there like Carol McKay Booker, Simeon Booker, Maurice Jackson, and I'll get a chance to moderate, so I'm sure I'll have something to say. This is wonderful to have you here again, Jonathan. So let's welcome Jonathan Rieder and celebrate the Gospel of Freedom.
So I'm mainly going to be speaking about the letter from Birmingham Jail today, but I first want to set the scene. We have some images of those events of '63, but it's a half century ago. And I just want to, again, try to revive them briefly. The legendary Fred Shuttlesworth and his Alabama Christian movement for human rights. The protests begin in Birmingham, that place of fierce racism and violence. King ends up going to jail. While he's in jail, he writes his famous letter from Birmingham Jail. The mass meetings of Birmingham, vibrating with the sound of I'm on my way to Canaan land, and I woke up with my mind stayed on freedom. The defiant young who only a couple days from now, on May 2nd, took the movement into their own hands and burst through the doors of 16th Street Baptist Church and took on the diabolical lawman Bull Connor. The next day, Connor losing it in a great moment. And Bobby Kennedy would later say, President Kennedy said the Civil Rights Act of 1964 should have been called the Bull Connor Bill, because Bull Connor had kept his cool, and then he loses it on Double D Day and deploys the dogs and the fire hoses. The New York Times has an amazing picture of that snarling dog with his teeth in the stomach of a black bystander, as it turned out, and Kennedy finally being shocked or horrified out of his evasive and diffident stance on civil rights and realizing something must be done to define civil rights as a national and moral issue. And so Connor then ended up playing his role as a prop in the movement theater. which Wyatt T. Walker, the logistical mastermind of Birmingham, certainly realized at the moment. And before long, there's the momentum towards the March on Washington, and I Have a Dream, and finally the Civil Rights Act of '64, and then that fall, the revenge murder of 4 little girls in 16th Street Baptist Church. And so, I'm coming only 2 weeks fresh from Birmingham and spending time with one of the prosecutors of the cold case of some of those Klansmen who had evaded punishment for so long. And in his famous Doug Jones, the amazing Doug Jones, and in his jail summary, saying, why does it matter, and it wasn't 50 years later then, it was more like 35 years later, trying to get the jury to understand this matters what happened a while ago because we became the country we are today and perhaps imagined ourselves to be in part because of the events 50 years ago. So I think it's fair to say that in the spring and summer of '63, something fundamental in America's racial order cracked. And again, it wasn't nirvana. There were many martyrs ahead, but nonetheless, these are critical moments. So before I get to the letter, it's important to remember that victory was not guaranteed. And King's spirit in early April was faltering. And it wasn't hateful whites, but diffident blacks who discouraged him. The protest began. King made his plea, but only about 5% of the black ministers of Birmingham supported King's protests. Not enough blacks signed up to go to jail. And so when you listen to King, and one of the things I've tried to do in Gospel of Freedom is I've been privileged to have very rare recordings that were only recently discovered, recently meaning the last 10 years, of King in the mass meetings before and after he goes to jail. And in a sense, what I've tried to do in this book is take the sound, because King was really a speaker rather than a writer. And so try to add that sound back, and with it, the passion. And there's a lot you miss when you read King. And so in a way, I'm trying to read Letter from Birmingham Jail by hearing King in the mass meetings, because there are many things that sort of are informative about that. So when you listen to King on Wednesday night, April 10th, he sounds testy and even bitter. And you hear him like he rarely sounds. He's talking about blacks who are unfit to be free, who are traitors to their race. He's discouraged. He thinks the movement is headed towards failure. And already in March, before the protests began, King was back in Atlanta. And he was preaching on a Sunday to the Ebenezer congregation. And he told how the children of Israel thought they could get to the promised land by God's power. But God, and King is now speaking as if he's God, rebukes Moses and said, why for are you crying unto me? Go tell the children of Israel to go forward. And you can hear the irritation in King's voice as God, he says, don't sit around waiting for me to do it all by myself. So the point about this is, and I can't stress it enough, if the letter was a moral statement about whites and what they failed to do morally, the mass meetings were about what blacks should do and what they had failed to do. And so the gospel of freedom is demanding all God's children had to show moral courage, were responsible for liberation. So after much indecision, Good Friday, April 12th in 1963, King decided to violate the injunction against protests and to go to jail. He would suffer on the cross like his Savior. And here's another intriguing thing. How many times had King preached, they can put you in jail and redeem you to glory? But this time, King goes crashing down into panic and depression. He was separated from Ralph Abernathy, his prison buddy. King had had a traumatic experience years before, which Andy Young told me he attributed to King's fear of being in jail alone, not just the obvious things that you don't know what could happen to you, a black man in that moment, but King had been taken out of the Atlanta jail and put in a straitjacket and in the dark driven across the state of Georgia to the Reidsville prison, and he was convinced that he was going to be killed by the Klan. And so here King is, Friday night, Good Friday, and instead of feeling that spirit that he's suffering and proud to suffer, he's just in fragile shape. And years later, he will write about, he had something like a breakdown. So in the darkness of cell, he spirals down into this bad state, but everything changes for King. We think on April 15th, but it could have been the 16th. I think it was the 15th, when a black trustee snuck him the newspaper. And he reads the statement by these 8 white clergy, the most esteemed clergy in all of Alabama. The lone esteemed rabbi, Grafman, the Catholic priest, but basically 6 Protestant ministers of every denomination. And they have criticized King for being an extremist, for precipitating violence. The protests, they say, are untimely. And these were the moderates. These were the most enlightened. They had actually criticized George Wallace's famous inaugural speech in January. And suddenly, King is surging up out of the valley of depression on a tide of indignation. So let me say why this is so important. Well, there's one other point. You got to picture this. He's surging up out of the valley, and he's scribbling. He has no writing instruments. He's scribbling on the margins of newspapers, and eventually on toilet tissue. And as Andrew Young told me, he said, it's one of the good things about prison toilet tissue. You could write on it, luckily. It's like, So you've got like the majestic letter, and you got like the earthiness of its production. So we need to remember that furious energy. Because for all the images of the letter as a treatise on the philosophy of nonviolence, for all our popular images of King as a dreamer, the letter starts not as fancy philosophy, but as a black cry of black pain and black anger. That's not all it is, but it begins in that. So the letter and the man that come rippling off these pages has a glorious complexity. Pretty amazing guy. They're the constant displays of his exquisite manners. He's a well-bred man, a Morehouse man of exquisite refinement. My dear fellow clergymen. And I have a recording that I discovered in which it's King's first public appearance after jail, and suddenly you hear him going, these preachers are calling us naughty. He's demoted my dear fellow clergymen. The gentility of the man. Since you are sincere men, I will answer you in a reasonable and I hope patient terms. My dear Christian and Jewish brothers. There's also King the professor who lectures on moral law and the distinction between a just law and an unjust law, and invokes Buber and Tillich, which also he's a little bit of a show-off from time to time. There's the tour guide King who takes whites into the inner recesses of black vulnerability. And it's a sentence, it's the most dramatic part of the letter. It's almost 300 words. When your first name becomes nigger, when your middle name becomes boy, when you have to explain to a 6-year-old girl and find yourself stammering why she can't go to Funtown and have to tell her it's because she's colored. When you suffer from a degenerating sense of nobodiness, King letting whites into that inner world. And we can talk about that if there's interest, because there's many good things, fascinating things about that. Just when you think King is about to explode, when you, and it's a black you at that moment, it's almost like he's in a swoon and he pulls out of it and then somehow says, then you, meaning the white clergyman, will finally understand why we find it hard to wait. There's the traveler King who goes on road trips, and King always loved to tell about trips. He'd be on a plane, he'd tell the Ebenezer congregation, and he always sitting next to a white woman that said, I have nothing against colored people, I just wouldn't want my daughter to marry one. And King tells Ebenezer, I told her I wouldn't want my daughter to marry George Wallace. And, and you hear whenever King gets into more down-home kind of badass, he does have a badass side, you hear the mass meetings erupt in such pleasure, enjoying this refined man, giving us another sense of the man. So here he is on a road trip, and he says, I have often, and it sounds like the reflective ruminator, I've often driven by your, meaning white churches, and looked at the beautiful spires and wondered, what people worship there? Who is their God? But if you think at who is their God, it's almost like maybe the king and those people don't share the same God. There's the chilly distance of observation. And then he says, where were they when Governor Wallace put down his brutal cry of defiance? And finally, there's the staccato embrace of extremism. And King has been very affable. He's entertaining all of their doubts about him. And he says, and he's been showing, no, I'm not extremist. There are blacks who are adjusted to segregation, and there's Elijah Muhammad's black nationalists. He's creating himself as if, see, I'm a moderate like you. He's trying to please them, and suddenly he switches on a dime and says, the more I thought about it, I took pleasure in thinking, I am an extremist. Jesus was an extremist. Bless those who curse you. Amos was an extremist. Let justice run down like water. And he's using the words of these indisputable authorities to slap back at those who've questioned him. So more than anything else, the letter becomes a relentless smackdown of ordinary white people who considered themselves decent people, but never really bothered much about black suffering. It was also a smackdown of the hypocritical clergymen who cooperated with evil, and what really burned King. And we know this backstage, but you can feel it in the letter. These clergymen who would say, follow the desegregation laws because it's the law, but they would not preach because the Negro is your brother and because segregation is blasphemy. They too bore complicity in the sin of racism. So as this furious truth-telling suggests, for all its swerves, the letter has a direction. At the midpoint I show in the Gospel of Freedom, King abandons the effort to persuade whites, to justify the movement to them, to entice them, and he becomes the prophet who chides and chastises. The diplomat recedes and the prophet emerges. And as I begin, kind of make my way towards the end, and we can open this up for questions, what I want to argue is that if we're meeting King anew, if you read the letter right, it turns out the ambassador of brotherhood was not just a dreamer, he was a Christian warrior, and a tough Christian warrior. He wasn't naive about the power of moral language to change white hearts. He didn't think very many whites had much empathy. I should have realized that few members of the oppressor race can understand the deep groans or passionate yearnings of the oppressed race, very close to racial determinism. Not far from Malcolm X, when he says, you, meaning white people, have been as cold as icicles to us. Despite his dignity, you can't miss the cold, controlled anger roiling close to the surface. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. It rings in King's ear. King has abandoned the perspective of all mankind and joined every Negro at that moment. It pierces him as well. So toward the end of the letter, King observes, I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham. And let's think about this a moment. The movement is in peril. King gets out of jail on April 20th. We're still 2 weeks away from the young people taking to the streets. The injunction has made people afraid to go to jail. The movement's in terrible shape. The Kennedys have been doing everything they can to keep protests from starting again, saying work on voter registration. So, and King had run out of adults willing to go to jail. And King was a cautious guy. He didn't want to use the young because he knew they would be criticized. And once he was criticized, Bobby Kennedy is calling, how can we afford to have a black child hurt? And King answers, as King tells it while preaching, black children are hurt every day. People think of this notion, they don't understand that King not only could be an angry black man, he wasn't afraid to share it, often with the Kennedys. And he was so mad at President Kennedy for not declaring a new Emancipation Proclamation that maybe an act of passive aggression, but aggression, he refused to go to the White House on the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. He was so angry. So, given the dire state of the movement, it looked like Albany, Georgia, 1962 all over again. Where does he get his confidence? And here's the odd thing. King did not cite the usual reasons he has for hope. There is a balm in Gilead. The Lord will make a way out of no way. My God is able. After the crucifixion is the resurrection. The promised land lies on the other side of the house of bondage. So that's a mystery in a way. And he didn't really place any hope in the language of the American dream. He used it cosmetically and sometimes not so cosmetically. But it's not a central part of a lot of his certainly his rhetoric while preaching, but even in mass meetings. So I want to say, in answering this mystery, it turns out that years before the public flowering of black pride, King finds solace in his love of black people and his respect for their spirituality and their courage. And what he says at that moment, he returns to the slave ancestors. And if you listen to King's preaching, going back to the 50s, he never forgets the slave experience. He always honors the ancestors. And he sees himself in the line of the old slave preacher. And sometimes in one sermon he preaches, he adopts the voice of that old slave preacher who would tell his people, you ain't no nigger, you ain't nobody, you are somebody. He would channel the slaves. And what he says, but this is a document, it's a crossover document, he's addressing white people. He says, abused and scorned though we may be, which is the title of an old slave spiritual, Buked and Scorned. The same song he asked Mahalia Jackson to sing before I Have a Dream at the March on Washington. Abused and scorned though we may be, we were here before Plymouth. The Pilgrims came to Plymouth. We were here before Jefferson etched the words, the mighty words of the Declaration of Independence. That is this defiant insistence of a black right to belong predates all of these civil religious authorities. And as soon as he's done that, he segues into another one of his favorite forms of ancestor worship with preaching. For 200 years, our forebears built the homes of the masters. They made Cotton king. And they suffered the humiliating indignities of slavery. And then he says, if the inexpressible cruelties, inexcusable cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the temporary setbacks in Birmingham will not stop us now. So I want to close by pointing out it's easy to see the lurch forward in Birmingham as inevitable, the fallible nation destined to perfect itself. And that's how Obama often uses that language of American exceptionalism. But in truth, there was no destiny of democracy. As King saw it, America was no redeemer nation. It was a nation in need of redemption. And he says it in so many different ways, in mass meetings and while preaching. America, you must be born again. You are sinful like Dives, refusing to acknowledge the gimpy Lazarus at the door, oozing with sores. The sin is not recognizing the suffering. America is Dives, who cannot recognize Lazarus. And this becomes clear, I think, in one of the most dramatic discoveries in my Gospel of Freedom. There was an alternative version of Letter from Birmingham Jail that King preached 2 days after getting out to a black audience. And nobody knows about this, but in some of it, he's preaching directly the words from Letter from Birmingham Jail. But because you have the sound, when he says those same words from the letter, you can hear the anger and exasperation. You can hear it when it's the same anger you hear right after Bull Connor has used the hoses, in which he says, "Ow, you can get your water, and you can get your dogs, and Bull Connor can get his white tank." Connor actually had a tank, like an army tank. And King says to the mass meeting, and you know it's a white tank. And again, the crowd cracks up. But then he switches out of that humor immediately. Bull Connor can get his white tank, and our black faces will stand up to his white tank. So now here's a piece. You can hear that same angry tremor 2 days after he's written the letter, or written most of the letter. And you're going to hear him say, "And we are through with segregation now, henceforth and forever." I'm not going to add the inflection back because you're about to hear it. And we don't have anything fancy. We don't have the right connection, but most places I've played this, the microphone has worked plenty fine. It's a 50-year-old. This is recording made 50 years ago on like old-fashioned, the sound isn't perfect, but you'll get a flavor if everybody stays pretty quiet of what King sounded like. And you're going to hear him at one point talk a little bit about the new mayor that had been elected. There had been a runoff, and the new letter that the New York Times was so happy about, saying this is a new day in Birmingham. The new mayor was a moderate segregationist. He had worked for the White Citizens Council, had crafted many of the arguments against even Eisenhower's 1957 Civil Rights Bill. So you're going to hear King talk about the difference that the Times cannot, in fact, do not define, and the Washington Post. They're highly critical of King until the dogs and the fire hoses. So you're going to hear King also doing a more humorous, down-home version of the distinction between a moderate and non-moderate segregationist. And that last line is really critical in terms of understanding King's sense that blacks were on their own, essentially in an indifferent nation. He never gave up his strong reaching out to white allies and his white friendships, but he understood we're basically on our own. Nobody will give us our freedom. The oppressors will not respond to the oppressed. At the close of the spoken black version of the letter, King imagines freedom bells ringing from Red Mountain in Alabama and the day that blacks would be able to sing, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty." Was this a celebration of American exceptionalism, of the idea that we were destined for democracy? Hardly. Because he also said something in the 16th Street Baptist Church that day, if America is to be a great land. It was a taunt. America was not yet a great land. If blacks were, quote, to be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, 'tis of thee," if they were able to sing it all, first King preached, blacks would have to bring that day by protesting together and going to jail together. In short, the nation that most white Americans thought they lived in wouldn't exist until black people created it. Thank you.
Thank you, John Rieder. That was just absolutely moving and powerful. And you have told us why you wrote this book, because you want to not only capture memory, but remind us that this country is in constant need of redemption. And the redemption is an ongoing action that we as a people have to deal with and struggle with and fight with. As you know, the usual pattern is to have questions, and we record these, and there are two microphones. Please go to the microphones so that not only everyone here can hear you, but people who will listen to this later can hear you, and we'll begin our discussion. And since this is kind of a public meeting, if you're comfortable telling us your name, please do so. Michael? Stand up. Yes, stand up and be at the microphone.
Michael Kazin, my name. It's a great talk. I can tell you sort of channeling King in some ways, in your own style, though. I've never heard you talk before, so maybe you've always done that. I don't know. One quick comment and one question. Comment, I often assign the letter to my students in U.S. history courses, and I did it this semester. And I asked before, when I told them I was assigning it, how many had already had it assigned in classes, and almost everyone raised their hands, at least the U.S.-born students. But when I taught it, we talked about it. The one part of it that they seem unfamiliar with is something you didn't mention, which is the internationalism of it. The sentence is about nations in Asia and Africa, I think Latin America too, are going at warp speed or something to freedom, while we're still in the buggy stage. That's paraphrasing it badly. So I wonder if you could comment on that part of it, which you didn't, and also on the religious side of it, if you maybe could comment on David Chappell's idea that the civil rights movement was a revival, and how that fits with the more secular elements.
Yeah, the King's amazing ability, I had many different kinds of amazing abilities, but one of them was to be able to never lose his sense that he's delivering my people. It's a phrase he uses over and over. So in Letter from Birmingham Jail, he says, I am here because injustice is here. But when he's in Selma, he also says, I am here because my people are suffering. I am here to help you sing. Come by here, Lord, Lordy, Lordy, and he goes on. So I think you're hitting at something very important, that King always saw himself as both appealing as a minister to humanity globally. And this wasn't a late 60s Vietnam era incarnation. As you say, in the letter, he puts the black struggle in America in a larger global context. But what's just as interesting is in that alternative black version of letter, before he even goes into having been in jail, the first thing he does is say, I remember on a day and night back in I think it was 58, I was in Ghana for the installation of Kwame Nkrumah as the first leader, 56. So wait, thank you. I need a historian to help, the pseudo-historian. So the important thing about that is King always had a global horizon, and he never held that back when he was dealing with the most unlettered audiences in the Black Belt. So when we look at 1967 and people are starting to get very nervous in SCLC saying, don't be against the war, you're going to get Lyndon Johnson mad, worry about black people. King says, I am a minister of God before I'm a civil rights leader. And I have to care about the suffering of Vietnam. So his global consciousness is there from the beginning and really critical. As for Dave Chappelle, David, that's an incomparable piece of work. So he's done incomparable, great work. Technically, is it a revival or is it drawing on the passion of the black pulpit? I'm not equipped historically to take that, to determine that. And I think we can't forget the secular part of the civil rights movement, as you alluded to, but I think you can't understand any of King's coterie backstage without understanding these were not cool, kind of liberal Protestants for whom Jesus was just a historical guy. These were people who really believed passionately in the character of their Christianity, and it's impossible to separate what they did from their Christian faith. And you hear this in the meetings all the time, and it can be in the, James Bevel saying, and these white people don't even understand about the crucifixion. That's why they put King in jail. Well, you can put a man in jail, but he's bound to resurrect. He's talking to people who understand that revivalistic language of a passionate Christianity.
Gail Chaddock. John, could you tell us the moment in your research when it occurred to you that the words weren't enough? There was something you saw or you heard in these visual images, and you needed to get deeper into it.
Now you're going to make me confess to incompetence. Gail, I knew it. There you go. We were assistant professors together at Swarthmore back in the day, so she's entitled to take liberties. So, in the middle of my last book on King, The Word of the Lord is Upon Me, I thought I was done about 8 years before I was done. And I had taken a very kind of simple dichotomy of King's black talk and his white talk, and I started, hearing things the more I listened to his sermons. And I spent a lot of time at the Howard Divinity School sermon collection, and I started tracking down mass meetings, the recordings. And the more that I listened, the more I realized I'm just scratching the surface. That I've caught the man based on his public occasions or in the written versions, and I'm missing things. And so I knew even back then. That's why it took so long. And my publisher's going saying, well, this is a great book. Let's get it out. You'll deal with that later. And I said, well, if tenure means anything, I can take 7 more years to get it right. That was not the answer that they were looking for. So it was when I realized, hearing all the parts of King that were on audio, the sarcasm, the tenderness, his view of the healer of black wounds, all of these things, so that was years ago that I realized I had to go to sound. So this, in a way, that insight governed my return to this book, utterly. And, you just hear, it's such a richer, simply as an individual, it's a richer, more fascinating human being who's emerging. You also hear him faltering. You hear him when he's weak and scared. So just simply the full dimensions of the humanity of the man. And then it allows you to go back to even understand the addresses to whites in a different light. Because I don't think until I had heard him in church talking about the ancestors that I fully understood the significance that he ends and begins the March on Washington speech with the voice of the slaves. Because I hadn't heard how constantly King was saying, we were here. And in fact, he said it at the National Cathedral in one of his last sermons right before his death, that you hear a really intense version of that at the National Cathedral. Yep.
Hi, my name is Marie Lathers. I'm really fascinated by people who are able to write in a material sense with pen on paper or pencil in difficult environments, so in jails. And I'm wondering if you could say a little more, because I don't know anything about this, about his conditions. You talked about the newspaper and the toilet paper, about other things about how he wrote, or how this got to publication. Did it get out before he got out of jail? I just don't know the history.
It is a fascinating story about the production of the letter. And you have to remember that King, he didn't love writing. that really wasn't his preferred mode. And what Andrew Young said is, look, if King could have gone and preached this to them, and of course there's another kind of complexity that we can get into or not later, that he never sent them the letter, but, would he have gone knocked on the door and preached to the 8 priests? Well, he wasn't really talking to the 8 ministers. They were a trigger for other things. But, so here he is, writing out of fury, scribbling. Clarence Jones gets in to see him April 16th, and Jones just can't believe, he thinks, like, King has lost it. He's just, like, so going crazy over these ministers. Wyatt T. Walker told me, and Wyatt T. Walker played an important role in transcribing the notes and then smuggling them back in for the editing. So around April 16th, 17th, 18th, he started getting writing utensils and pads, because other lawyers were then involved. But Wyatt Walker is thinking, why is King so upset about a bunch of white preachers? It's what we expected of them. We've got to liberate black people. We've got to get protests going. Why is he worried about these guys? And it was only later that a lot of the SCLC guys who were race men, yes, they cared about integration, but they really cared about freeing black people before they were worried about integration. And, they were more concerned about other things. So meanwhile, I think as this process was going on, it's later they understood the significance. So King is scribbling. It goes back to Wyatt T. Walker, smuggled out the first day, Clarence Jones stuffing it down the front of his pants to kind of smuggle it out. And there's a 17-year-old secretary, and I told this story earlier this morning, so I'll apologize, but from Vidalia, people are saying, Philly guys cannot say Vidalia right. Vidalia. No. But she's looking at this and saying, Dr. King may be a great preacher, but he sure can't write. And I believe she may have gone on to be, no, that's a side story. We'll leave that go. But in any case, she's trying to figure it out. It's going back and forth. King gets out of jail on April 20th. Sometime after that, it's released to the press. The journalists don't particularly pick it up as this great work or a star. It's pretty much ignored. Walker, who's worried about the movement, public relations, is working on the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee in Philadelphia, who are the first people to publish it at the end of May as a pamphlet. Christian Century publishes it June 12th rather. And then the New York Times is about to publish a fragment of it, but the New York Post publishes it first. And so the Times drops it, and New Republic has recently revisited this and those issues. So in a way, it's fair to say that it becomes a great document in retrospect. It's a small audience at first that understands how important it is. And it's only when King gets the Nobel Prize and the head of the Nobel Committee, in announcing it, is channeling King and quoting from it. And he said, these are words delivered to mankind. These are words for global injustice. They're words that arise from a context, but they're universal in scope. So the writing is a very complicated process. But if you go back, there's some scholars who've said, well, King couldn't have possibly written it. And the date on the letter is the 16th. And there's no way it wasn't written by the 16th. But, there are journalists in this crowd here who have rewrite people, and they're academics and writers who, and some of us have spouses who say, get rid of that and do that. So the editing process, I don't find that scholarly quibbling over, over King's whatever editorial intercessions were made afterwards, because in reality, almost every paragraph channels something King has said in the preceding 36 months. So it's all King's voice. It's all his words. There may be some trimming here and there. So, any other questions, comments on any aspect of this?
John, thank you for your being not only so informed, but for your passion, because that helped give us a sense. And come back again. And we're gonna, John Rieder's gonna sign books. You line up this way, help us with the chairs, and John's a good good conversationalist, so I'm sure there's more to say.
But I know you all, but I've also been informed to keep the line moving as well.
Yes,
correct?
yes, no, you keep the line moving as well.
Thank you for
We are selling books here. You were great. You were really great. Okay, terrific. Are you really a Philadelphia? I am. Strawberry.